I still want to talk to you all this morning along the lines of I dare you to commit yourself to growth. But I want to focus on the word sacrifice. I dare you to commit yourself to growth. And I want to focus on the word sacrifice. Now, in baseball, a sacrifice fly is a batted ball that satisfies 4 criteria. The batter is put out because an outfielder catches the ball on a fly. A runner who is already on base scores on the play. It is called a sacrifice fly because the batter presumably intends to cause a teammate to score a run while sacrificing his own ability to do so. I dare you to commit yourself to growth, and we're going to talk about sacrifice today. Are you willing? As it says here in this scenario about the sacrifice fly, it is called a sacrifice fly because the batter presumably intends to cause a teammate to score a run while sacrificing his own ability to do so. And basically, that's what Jesus did for you and I. He was willing to give up of himself so that we might be able to score. I want you to get this here now. And so we're going to talk about sacrifice, this word sacrifice for a moment. I dare you to commit yourself to growth. A lot of times, a lot of folk don't realize that being willing to sacrifice is part of growing. Being willing to sacrifice is a part of growing. And so, as we see here, the batter was willing to give up his opportunity so that another runner could score, called a sacrifice fly. Now, we're going to start off by looking at the results of our sacrifices. We have to look at the results of our sacrifices to see if our sacrifices are acceptable unto God. We have to look at our sacrifices to see if our sacrifices are acceptable unto God. We make sacrifices for our husbands. Wives make sacrifices all the time for their husbands. Matter of fact, at some point in time or some way or another, we're going to make some kind of a sacrifice. We're going to make some kind of a sacrifice. And so we see here that we make sacrifices for our husbands. Wives are willing or generally make sacrifices for their husbands. Husbands generally make sacrifices for their wives. Parents generally make sacrifices for their children. We always hear how parents have made sacrifices for their children. We always hear how husbands have made sacrifices for their wives. We always hear how wives have made sacrifices for their husbands. We always hear it all the time, how people are always making sacrifices for others. Now, we make sacrifices on our jobs. A lot of times, people make sacrifices on their jobs so that things can be better on the job, or so that they can be in a position perhaps to get a promotion or to get a raise or to be recognized or whatever. But a lot of times, people make sacrifices on their jobs. A lot of times, people make sacrifices for careers. People set out to become something in life, and so as a result of it, you hear them say how they made sacrifices for that particular career. We hear about it, and we see it all the time. People make sacrifices. There are times when people make sacrifices for their businesses. Folk who may have just started a business, or folk who may have a business, a lot of times you find them making sacrifices for their business. I want you to get a hold of this here now. There are times when people make sacrifices for their education. We see it all the time. Anybody who ever went to college or who's in college knows that people make sacrifices all the time for their education. I don't know how much they do it in high school or in junior high school or in elementary school, but people are always making sacrifices. And so we need to see how that folk are willing to make sacrifices all the time. Yeah. Now, people make sacrifices for their churches. How many times have people made sacrifices for their churches? They do it all the time. Folk are always making sacrifices for their churches. Some folk are, not everybody. Folk are always making sacrifices for family members. How many times have we made sacrifices for family members? How many times have we made sacrifices for our brother, our sister, our cousin, our grandfather, our grandmother, our mother, our father? How many times have we made these sacrifices? And so many times we find ourselves making sacrifices all the time. There are times when we've made sacrifices for our fellow man and fellow woman. Somebody may come to you and they may ask you to do something, or they may ask you to give up something. How many times have we sacrificed? We have to look at the results of our sacrifices to see if our sacrifices are acceptable unto God. But the way to weigh whether it is acceptable by God is if the result equals God. I want you to get that now. Many times, the sacrifices that we have made doesn't equal God. Keep in mind, a sacrifice is an act of giving up something you value for the sake of something more important. Sacrifice. Keep in mind, a sacrifice is an act of giving up something that you value for the sake of something that's more important. The question is, does all these things of value outweigh the importance of God being first in our lives? The question is, does the sacrifices that we make for our husbands, the sacrifice that we make for our wives, the sacrifice that we make for our children, the sacrifice that we make for our jobs and our careers and our businesses and our education and our churches and our family members and our fellow man and woman, does all of those things outweigh, or does it deem to be more important than God being first in our lives? I want you to get this now. So many times, and keep in mind, a sacrifice is an act of giving up something you value for the sake of something more important. Do we consider God to be important? Or is God just something else that's in line with everything else? Because a lot of people have put their jobs first. A lot of people have put their children first. A lot of people have put their wives first. A lot of people have put their husbands first. A lot of people have put their careers and their businesses and their education and their churches and their family members. They put those things first. You see it all the time. I dare you to commit yourself to grow. are you willing to sacrifice? So the question is, does all these things of value outweigh the importance of God being first in our lives? So if any of these things that were named is placed ahead of God, then you have made your decision. Wow. Let me give you that again. I'm going to give you that again because you may not have swallowed that one just right. I'm going to make sure you digest this one. And I'll run through those things again. We make sacrifices for our husbands, our wives, our children, our jobs, our careers, our businesses, our education, our churches, our family members, our fellow man or woman. So if any of these things that were named is placed ahead of God, then you have made your decision. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, which was acceptable unto God. Just look at the results. Because Jesus was willing to sacrifice, that's why you and I are here today. That's why you and I have the opportunity to get our lives together and to get on track with God. Why? Because Jesus was willing to make that sacrifice. So many times, the question is, are we willing to make the same sacrifice for God? Or we'll make it for a job. Or we'll make it for our children. Well, I heard it when I was growing up. I heard it all the time, how my mother would work long hours and how she would stand on her feet all day long and how she would do this and how she would do that, how she would make this sacrifice for her children. But are we willing to do the same for God? Or we'll make it for our children. Or we'll make it for a job. We'll make it for our careers. We'll make it for our education. We'll make it for our business. We'll make it for our husbands and our wives. And we'll make it for our family members. And we'll make it for this one and that one. But are we willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for God? Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, which was acceptable unto God. Just look at the results. We and many others are the results. Don't you understand that because of the sacrifice that Jesus made, that's why you're able to be here today? It's not because of you. You didn't even get yourself up this morning. You thought you did. But it was because of the sacrifice that Jesus made. Wow. The sacrifice that Jesus made for you was the result of it. Only you can determine the outcome. We are the fruit or the results of his sacrifice. In the Old Testament, the sacrifices that were made was never enough. And many times when we make sacrifices for husbands and wives and children and jobs and careers and businesses and education and churches and so forth and so on, a lot of times it's still never enough. It's temporary. You got it. Because then you got to come back and do it all over again. And all over again. And all over again. How many times have you made sacrifices for husbands and wives and children and folk? They don't even appreciate it. And they let you know they don't appreciate it. But we started making these sacrifices. In the Old Testament, the sacrifices that were made was never enough. They were only acceptable for a moment. Some sacrifices we make are just temporary for a moment because it's not really in our hearts. In Romans chapter 12, verse 1, in the Amplified, it says, I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, and beg of you in view of all the mercies of God, to make a decisive dedication of your bodies, presenting all your members and faculties as a living sacrifice, holy, devoted, consecrated. Look at them words they're using. Holy, devoted, consecrated, and well-pleasing to God, which is your reasonable, rational, intelligent service and spiritual worship. That's the least you can do. Yeah. But so many times, and come on, some folk that are not here today because they're making sacrifices for something else instead of God. As I said before, so if any of these things that were named is placed ahead of God, then you've already made your decision. In Psalms 51, verse 16 through 17, in the Amplified, it says, for you delight not in sacrifice, else would I give it. You find no pleasure in burnt offering. Verse 17, my sacrifice, the sacrifice acceptable to God, is a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, a broken down with sorrow for sin and humbly, thoroughly penitent. Such, O God, you will not despise. Let me give you that again. And this is in the Amplified. My sacrifice, the sacrifice acceptable to God, is a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, broken down with sorrow for sin and humbly and thoroughly penitent. Such, O God, you will not despise. That's why the woman who came and washed Jesus' feet with her hair and her tears, she was broken. She realized that Jesus, all that Jesus had done for her. And so she was broken. She was willing to humble herself. She was willing to stoop down low so that she might be able to be in the company of Jesus. For some of us, we still riding high in our pride. And sometimes it takes a moment or two for God to break us. The psalmist David was broken. After he had finished going through what he had went through, he was broken. And then even some things thereafter he experienced. He said, you will not despise. And I want you to notice the word broke is mentioned 3 times in this translation, saying, are we willing to risk giving up everything that we consider to be valuable to make him of more importance than those things or people? Are we willing to risk giving up everything? The struggle we have is we're not willing to give up everything for God. But I've seen people give up everything for their husbands, and give up everything for their wives, and give up everything for their children, and give up everything for their jobs, and give up everything for their careers, and give up everything for their businesses, and give up everything. They just give up everything. I've heard some folks say they had to live out of their car because they were sacrificing, because they wanted to be whatever they wanted to be. Are we willing to sacrifice for the Lord?